building of the very first Transcontinental Railroad began when the United States Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862. This act gave the authorization needed to begin building the actual railroad. This was a diversion from the past where the government did not want to give consent for internal improvements. In the Pacific Railroad Act, it was stated in the first section that by the Secretary of the Interior are hereby created and erected into a body corporate by the name of the Union Pacific Railroad, and the said corporation is hereby authorized and empowered to lay out, locate, construct, furnish, maintain, and enjoy a continuous railroad and telegraph from a point on the 100th meridian of longitude west, and in the 11th section, for 300 miles of said railroad, most mountainous and difficult of construction, to wit, 150 miles westerly from the eastern base of the Rocky Mountains and 150 miles eastwardly from the western base of the Sierra Nevada Mountains. The Union Pacific Railroad worked westward from Omaha, Nebraska to meet the Central Pacific Rail lines, which were working eastward from Sacramento, California. The railroad building was completed on May 10, 1869, when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines connected tracks at Promontory Summit, Utah. To initiate the process of building, the government gave land grants to the railroad companies in exchange for their work in laying the tracks out in designated areas. The typical process of distributing land was to alternate sections that were laid out next to the tracks, in which one section would go to the company and then the next would be kept by the government. The railroad companies would sell their land and use their profits to buy materials and pay for labor. Oftentimes, the layout of the land appeared as a checkerboard. The literal building of the railroad was a long and drawn-out process. There were still tensions between the North and South that prevented Congress to make an agreement on where the line would actually begin. The Central Pacific, coming from the west, mainly consisted of Chinese immigrant workers, whereas the Union Pacific mainly consisted of Irish immigrant workers. While Irish immigrants had some of the most laborious work and were poorly paid, none worked like the Chinese. Chinese workers typically worked for lower wages and became victims of violence from the white, underemployed working class. They were rather upset because their positions were being filled by immigrants. Chinese workers had some of the most hardest and dangerous jobs that they took on willingly and did well with. Because of their impressive performance, in which they showed up on time, rarely took breaks, and stayed in good health with rare sick days, the number of Chinese workers at the tracks increased throughout the 18th. After silver was discovered in Nevada, majority of the white workers left in hopes of finding their own fortune. By 1869, 11,000 of the workers were Chinese. During this time, the Chinese endured much discrimination. In fact, they didn't have citizenship, voting, court, or property rights. There were also differences between the whites and the Chinese workers' salaries. Whites received $35 per month, including rooming, while Chinese workers worked for $25 per month, but had to pay for their own supplies while laboring for extremely long hours, 7 days a week. Oftentimes, a lot of workers risked their lives while working on dangerous conditions such as long, cold winters in snowstorms, blazing hot summers in the deserts with no shade, and on dangerous terrain on the mountain. A lot of men had to hang from baskets while blowing part of the mountain away so they had access to the land in order to lay tracks. No lives were lost, but a good amount of the workers suffered from internal bleeding within their lungs due to the alkali metal. The Chinese workers set the record of laying 10 miles of track in one day. The railroad was finished in 1869 when the lines met at Promontory Point in Utah and was celebrated through the Golden Spike ceremony. Overall, railroads allowed for faster and safer transportation across the country, as well as provided a way to ship agricultural items, among other things, from a vast portion of the country. But most importantly, it allowed for more settlers to venture out and increase the West population, ending the last step of the frontier line's end.